Good afternoon, Mr. Poplett. Mr. McGregor.
Mr. Poplett, before lunch we were looking at HTM 0301 from 2007, so bundle 2, document 8, and if I could ask you to please look at page 777. You see that that's headed up validation of specialised ventilation systems, and on the left-hand side we've got the concepts of commissioning and validation. What's commissioning?
Commissioning is the setting to work, and when it comes to ventilation, the balancing of the system to make sure that it functions as it should.
And then what's validation?
Validation, when you look at engineering services, they can all be commissioned in their own right. So a fire alarm system is commissioned to make sure that it does what it should do when it should do it. The ventilation system is balanced and commissioned to make sure it does what it should do. Validation is a process where you ensure that all of those building services that interact with one another do so as they should do. So in the example of fire alarm system and ventilation system, it's not unusual for a ventilation system to shut down in the event of a fire. However, in certain healthcare applications, such as isolation rooms where you're providing a protected environment, or indeed operating theatres, you do not want the ventilation system to shut down, as there could be a patient on the table in the middle of a procedure. As long as the smoke or the instrument that triggers the fire alarm isn't in the air duct supplying air to the theatre, the positive pressure cascade and the operation of the ventilation actually provides a relatively safe environment to be in the event of a fire. It certainly gives the surgical team hopefully enough time to stabilise and secure the patient so they can be safely evacuated to a suitable location where care can continue to be provided. That may be the continuation of the operating procedure. So it's not as simple as saying, well, the fire alarm system works in isolation and the ventilation system works in isolation. You need to make sure that they work together and don't create a problem or work in the strategy as it has been designed.
So in terms of stages, you do the commissioning and then after that you do the validation.
Correct.
Commissioning, making sure the individual components working, and then validation, making sure that all the components work together.
Correct. And for clarity, commissioning is often done as a direct result of or by the company who's done the installation. Validation should be done by an independent company to the installation.
And at what stage would validation be done? So in terms of a construction contract, would it be done before or after practical?
In my experience, it is often offered before practical completion, normally successfully completed after practical completion. Validation, particularly for ventilation systems, should only be taken when all aspects of the construction have been completed.
So if we look on to page 778, please, and to paragraph 8.10, which states, in order to be successful, the commissioning process must start before practical completion, as many parts of the system will become progressively less accessible. Do you see that? Yep. And do you agree with that?
Yes. And
it continues, the correct installation of those parts will need to be witnessed and leak rate tests carried out as construction proceeds. Failure to establish responsibility for commissioning early enough will delay the completion of the project or lead to unsatisfactory plant performance. Do you see that?
Yep.
And in relation to both commissioning and validation, what is the standard that it's being checked, the work's being checked against? Are we talking about the contractual specification or the health technical memoranda and associated guidance, or both?
It should be both. It should be checked against the HTM, the design intent, and the actual performance and contract.
And what would you expect to happen at either the commissioning and or the validation stage if there was non-compliance with a health technical memoranda or a health building note?
I would expect that it be flagged up. If it's at the commissioning stage, it should be by the installation or installer company, who should either be able to confirm that that was a pre-agreed derogation or that it is a non-conformance or non-compliance. If it's at the validation stage by an independent validator, I would expect them to flag it as non-compliant, but then refer it back for confirmation as to whether that was an agreed derogation or otherwise.
Thank you. If I can ask you to look on, still within the Health Technical Memorandum, to page 794, please. See here, Appendix 2, recommended air change rates.
Yep.
What do we see there?
It is an appendix to the principal document, which is intended to act as an aid memoir or a quick reference to the typical environmental conditions that would be identified typically within the ward areas or the clinical areas identified down the left-hand side.
And is this appendix new since HTM 2025?
Yes.
Why was it included? Why do we see things like a general ward and all of the areas there? Why are they listed in particular?
I'm not able to answer that in full detail. I wasn't involved at that stage in production at 2007. However, my understanding is that its intent was to act as a quick reference guide and endeavoured to amalgamate information from HBNs, which include information on ventilation, and HTMs, in this case HTM 2025, into a single point of reference. It was never intended to be the only page of the HTM that someone should read.
And was this general approach, this type of appendix, retained in terms of the HTM 2021 that you were involved in the creation of?
It was retained and expanded in the latest version of the HTM. However, it was significantly supplemented by an entire new chapter within the current HTM 0301, specifically highlighting which areas needed ventilation and why.
And do you know where the values that we see within this table, for example, for air changes per hour, where they come from?
Not specifically.
Are you aware of there being any specific scientific papers or modelling that underpins the specific air change rates within this table?
My understanding is that where appropriate, they are derived from Lidwell's original research, and some others are derived from other scientific sources, but they relate to control of pathogens. My understanding is that documentation is not generally within the public domain.
So why wouldn't it be within the public domain?
Because it contains highly sensitive and potentially dangerous information regarding pathogen and contamination levels.
And who would hold that information?
My understanding is that it's controlled through Porton Down.
And when you refer to Porton Down, what do you mean?
The Chemical Weapons Research Facility.
So a UK government facility?
Yes.
So in relation to, if we just take, for example, critical care areas with 10 air changes an hour, why is the figure 10 as opposed to 12 or 8?
Again, I don't have the specific scientific evidence based, but it is intended to represent a good rate of dilution to minimise potential infection transmission and risk.
And in terms of the refresh that you did for HTM 2021, were all the figures within this table discussed by a range of individuals?
Generally, yes. Some figures were amended, and during the rewrite, some of the figures were amended, but there is also, within 2007 version, a in-use tolerance, which was 75% of these stated figures, was still deemed to be an acceptable level. So as a facility or as a system becomes older, if its performance drops off, then there was a tolerance built in against these figures, which still left them as compliant and safe. Because some of the air change rates within the new HTM were lowered in a move towards supporting net carbon zero and carbon reduction, energy reduction, the percentage tolerance of in-use was again adjusted from 75 to 80%, with a minimum performance tolerance specified for example operating theatres. So it, to a certain extent, became more complex, but if you were familiar with and understood the principles, it was more appropriate and had slightly less of a safety margin but still maintained safe performance.
If a facility complied with the principles set out in HTM 2025, would it comply with everything that's set out in HTM 0301, both 2007 and 2021?
In terms of airflows and pressure regimes, yes. In terms of equipment and some efficiencies and equipment design, not necessarily.
And in terms of flow rates and air changes per hour, why do you say it would still comply?
Under 2025, I'll use the operating theatre as the example because it's the easiest and most well understood. An operating theatre under HTM 2025 required 20 air changes, and it had no tolerance for in-use degradation. So it should have done 20 air changes on day one. It should do 20 air changes the year after, and the year after. Within 0301-2007, air change rate was increased to 25 air changes, but with a 75% tolerance allowance, which effectively reduced the minimum airflow rates down to 18.75 air changes. So the 2007 standards for an operating theatre in use were lower than an operating theatre designed to 2025. Under 0301-2021, we reduced the airflow rate to 22 air changes with an 80% tolerance. However, we specified a minimum air change rate within theatre of 18 air changes per hour. Therefore, a theatre designed to 2025, doing 20 air changes, should still be capable of complying to a theatre operated under 0301-2021 at 18 air changes.
Thank you. In relation to the guidance that's set out within the Health Technical Memoranda, is compliance mandatory?
No. It is not a legal requirement in and of itself. As I've discussed earlier, it is, in my opinion, should be taken as an approved code of practice. So compliance should be achieved, or a soundly based risk assessed approach and mitigation provided as to why compliance isn't being achieved, and where appropriate, what alternate methods are being employed to counter the non-compliance.
What practical steps would you suggest required to be taken if you're going to derogate from a standard within the Health Technical Memoranda?
The first thing is to outline exactly the scope of the derogation and the reason for requiring it. There are many legitimate and very sound reasons where a derogation may be appropriate, particularly if you are working within the confines of an existing facility. Having established what is being derogated and the reason why, it needs to be assessed against what the implications of that derogation would be. Those implications need to be assessed and considered and decided on whether it should be adopted or not. If it is adopted, it should be fully documented and recorded, not only on the project file during construction, but that derogation remains active for the life of that building. So as clinical function changes and develops, it's not only assessed against the original clinical function that it was being designed, but any future clinical function that it is then used for, to ensure that the derogation is still safe and appropriate.
So in relation to an existing facility that was perhaps being refurbished, are you indicating that there'd have to be a risk assessment if you're going to derogate from the Health Technical Memoranda standards?
I believe there should be a risk assessment whether it's a new facility or an existing facility for a derogation.
Okay. And really what I wanted to know is in relation to a new facility, just starting with a specification on a blank sheet of paper for a completely new facility, Would you be anticipating that there should be derogations from health technical memoranda?
I would like to think not. However, a hospital does not exist within its setting in isolation. There are planning restrictions, there are physical constraints of site, there are all sorts of things which can impact full compliance.
In your view, are there certain aspects of the health technical memoranda that simply shouldn't be derogated from?
My opinion is anything that directly could impact on patient or staff safety should never be derogated.
Because in paragraph 74 of your statements, that's on page 130 of bundle 6, paragraph 74, you say in all practical sense, my belief and interpretation is that the HTMs should be viewed as an approved code of practice and as such should be deemed in elements as minimum standards. Do you see that?
Yep.
So is that really, when you're talking about minimum standards, is that the idea of patient and staff safety?
Yes.
And then if we skip the next sentence, you go on in paragraph 74 to say it's not black and white, and I believe that organisations who choose to derogate from HTMs have an increased risk of potentially compromising patient outcomes, staff/visitor safety, in addition to increased risk of legal, civil and reputational damage. See that?
Yep.
So is that your views?
Yes.
And you go on at paragraph 75 in the second sentence to say, I wouldn't depart from any element that had a direct impact on patient, visitor or staff safety, which I would consider to be an absolute red line. Yes. So is that essentially your position? There can be derogations, but there's certain issues that relate to patient and staff safety that you simply, in your view, couldn't derogate from.
Correct.
The period that Health Technical Memoranda 0301, the 2007 version, is in force, is there any standardised procedure for a derogation from the standards set out within the guidance?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
So what happened in practice if a trust wanted to derogate from those standards?
In my experience, it was in well-run projects discussed, debated, agreed and recorded on a project file. But once agreed, was generally not subject to re-review at any stage, either up to or including project completion or indeed operation.
And in terms of a derogation, who would be approving the derogation? So if we think of a trust that's operating a hospital, do they simply self-certify that, or do they have to ask for approval from government?
Again, it varies in my experience. Now, it would be passed through the Ventilation Safety Group, which is a new group introduced in the latest HTM. Historically, prior to the rewrite of the HTM, it would, in my experience, most probably be decided at a project team level with either the project director and, in the best circumstances, input from directors of infection prevention control, other IPC team members and clinicians.
And in the case of a contractor...
Sorry, I just got a little bit behind. We just take that last bit of evidence in relation to the current practice and the previous good practice.
Certainly, I think we'll come on and deal with the ventilation safety group, but I think you were outlining to the inquiry your views on what should happen in terms of how a derogation should have taken place in the period up to HTM 2021.
Yes.
So can you just explain to the inquiry again what should have happened?
In an ideal circumstance where a derogation was sought under the 2007 standard, it should have been subject to multidisciplinary review and discussion. Normally, it was held at a project level. At that project level, it should have included discussions and agreement from director level, Director of Infection Prevention Control, IPC teams and clinicians.
And when you say IPC, you mean Infection Prevention
Control.
So in short, not just engineers deciding to derogate from standards?
Definitely not.
If there's a scenario whereby a new hospital was being built, so there's a construction contract in place and the contractor wanted to derogate from health technical memorandum, would it be the client, the trust, that would be approving the derogation?
Yes.
And if that contract contained a specification that wasn't compliant with the health technical memoranda guidelines and the contract permitted that, would you consider that there was a need for any formal derogation?
Yes.
Just explain what should happen in that scenario.
It should have still been recorded that, notwithstanding what the HTM stated, the contract had been based upon a design which required the following areas of non-compliance. So you still need to record what you aren't complying to and why.
What should happen if there was a conflict within the guidance in terms of there were two standards and you couldn't comply with both? What would happen in that scenario?
Then that discussion is where the multidisciplinary group would discuss it, identify which standard was the most appropriate and comply with the one that was most appropriate and record the fact that the other was derogated from because of that identified conflict.
Just thinking back to Appendix 2 that we've looked at, I think you mentioned that in your view that was general guidance that was being provided within that table. Would you agree that the question of whether or not a ward or a room in a hospital required any particular standard of air change rate would ultimately be a matter of clinical opinion?
Clinical and IPC.
So clinical and infection prevention and control. If I could ask you to look, please, to paragraph 87 of your statement, which is on page 135. You state there, to summarise, you cannot derogate from minimum standards if a ward or room is designed to do 10 air changes and you have an 80% tolerance within the current HTM and it falls below 8 air changes, it's non-compliant and should be shut. The recommended air change rates are the required standards to minimise the risk of adverse health impact, patients and staff. Do you see that?
Yep.
Would you accept that whether a ward or room should be shut in relation to any given air change rate would be a matter of clinical opinion?
Yes. And whilst that statement is correct, it technically would be non-compliant and should be shut if in discussion the risk to patients of closing the area was greater than the risk of operating it, then it would be derogated against. Equally, mitigation could be put in place to reduce the occupancy level, to maintain the ward open, reduce the number of occupants and the number of staff, therefore reducing the risk of aeromicrobiological contamination and accepting the lower rate of dilution.
So what would happen, for example, if the alternative accommodation was a Victorian hospital that may have poorer air quality and infection control? What should happen in that?
It would need looking at and assessing on its merits at the time. A modern ward that only does, if it was designed to do 10 and is only doing 7, may still be better than a ward with no ventilation that's in a different historic hospital. It's not the age of the place, it's the airflow performance that's critical.
Thank you. Can I ask you, please, within bundle 2, to look to page 695, which is an article from the Health Estates Journal called When to Seek Derogation and the Best Approach. Is that an article written by yourself?
It is.
Why did you feel the need to write that article?
It is a topic which is frequently debated and discussed at almost every NHS organisation that I've ever been involved with. I also have had numerous discussions with AEs, not only within my own engineering disciplines, but other engineering disciplines, and we generally agree that the process for managing derogation is not as clear-cut as it could be. I therefore sought to highlight the issue within the journal and wrote the article, and subsequently have developed a derogation protocol which is currently under peer review by individuals who I personally know, who, with a view to adopting it as my company recommendation for how derogations should be managed.
So just so I'm understanding you, in your view, there's been a lack of clarity historically about how one goes about the whole process of derogations, and in your view, there should be a standardised procedure to try to improve matters.
I believe so, yes.
So if we just look within the article on page 695, left-hand side, just above the bold legal, and the paragraph above that, state, debate over the status of all these documents can be highly contentious and generally is not definitively defined. However, in my opinion, the following elements need to be considered. Do you see that?
Yep.
Really a starting point about debate about just exactly what standards the guidance have, what authority the guidance has. And then in legal, approximately 6 lines up from the bottom of the left-hand corner, say the various devolved administrations agree that the documents produced are guidance documents. They become legal requirements when they form part of a contract. The guidance documents are generally considered an approved code of practice, or at the very least good practice. And again, is there some debate whether this is best practice or a good practice?
Again, I believe that it depends upon the individual clauses as to whether they're classified or categorised as good practice, best practice, or minimum standards.
Thank you. And then if we move on to page 696, we see in the bottom left-hand corner a bold heading, risk assessment. Do you see that?
Yep.
Whereby you state, while it is recognised derogation is required in some cases, this must be risk assessed, agreed and documented in order that it may be considered within the appraisal and approval process. Derogations must be properly authorised by the project's senior responsible owner and informed and supported by an appropriate technical, infection prevention, control and clinical advice, irrespective of a project's internal or external approval processes. Do you see that?
Yep.
Is that your personal view, or is that an industry-wide accepted view?
That is my personal view. The article was written specifically from my position. However, I think it is reflective on feedback I've received from individuals prior to publication and indeed individuals since publication that it is, I am not unique in my opinion.
I now want to move on and ask you some further questions about HTM 0301, so 2021, so the refresh that you were involved in. And I think you've already told us that Malcolm Thomas was the lead author still of that document, is that correct?
Correct.
And in terms of the process, you've told us that there was broad input from a range of disciplines. And can you just remind me, what were those disciplines?
They covered authorising engineers, professional institutes such as SIBSE, IHEM, SVH Society, HSA UK, now or then PHE, Public Health England, manufacturers, verifiers, installers, air handling unit manufacturers. A wide range of individuals were both on the primary committee or steering group and it was also sent out in its various draft formats, the detailed comment to professional institutes, societies, and various royal societies for the various medical disciplines. Royal colleges, always forget that term.
And you mentioned earlier in your evidence that one of the innovations within the new health technical memorandum from 2021 was the creation of a ventilation safety group.
Yes.
Can you just explain what is a ventilation safety group?
A ventilation safety group is intended as a multidisciplinary team, and it is reflected by the same principles as laid down in HTM 0401 for water, HTM 0601 for electrical safety, decontamination, medical gases. All of the HTMs have moved in recent versions to having this multidisciplinary approach where specific discussion can take place regarding that engineering discipline that it is responsible for, both to ensure and provide assurance that the systems are operating and being maintained in an appropriate condition, and any new projects that are planned are also taking due consideration of the influence of their respective engineering discipline. So for the VSG, ventilation.
So the concept of a safety group had existed in other areas, as you've said, such as water and electricity, but it was simply being new in the sense that it was being introduced for ventilation now.
Correct.
If I can ask you to look, please, within Bundle 2 to Document 5 at page 320, please. So Bundle 2, Document 5 at page 300. Health Technical Memoranda 0301, Specialised Ventilation for Healthcare Premises, Part A, Concept Design, Specification, Installation and Acceptance Testing of Healthcare Ventilation Systems. Is this the 2021?
Yes, it is.
If we look to page 321, do you see a blue box at the bottom?
Yep.
Which states this guidance is not mandatory unless specifically stated. However, any departure stroke derogations from this HTM, including the measures implemented, should provide a degree of safety not less than that achieved by following the guidance set out in this HTM. Do you see that?
Yep.
Why was that statement inserted?
It was inserted because it highlighted the fact that whilst not mandatory, we expect the guidance to be followed unless it is derogated, and in derogating, mitigation provided that provides equal or better compliance than the standard.
And then if we look over the page to page 322, please, in the bottom left-hand corner, see reference to various statutory standards plus technical standards and guidance. The health building notes are mentioned, for example. And then it continues, the need to demonstrate a robust process for agreeing any derogation from technical guidance is a core component of the business case assurance process. Do you see that?
Yep.
Now, was that new or did that exist prior to 2021?
It wasn't as explicit prior to this, so it is new from that perspective.
But were there business case assurance procedures before 2021?
Yes.
And it continues, the starting point for all NHS healthcare projects at project initiation document and or strategic outline case stage is one of full compliance. Do you see? It continues, derogations to standards will potentially jeopardise business case approval and will only be considered in exceptional circumstances. A schedule of derogations will be required for any project requiring any external business case approval and may be requested for those that have gone through an internal approvals process. While it is recognised that derogation is required in some cases, this must be risk assessed, documented, in order that it may be considered within the appraisal and approval process. Derogations must be properly authorised by the project's senior responsible owner and informed and supported by appropriate technical advice, irrespective of a project's internal or external approval process. You see that?
Yep.
So is that the innovation, really?
Yes.
If we could then look on to page 347, please. You see section 4, the design and specification process. So at 4.1, there's an analysis of the project brief. What's the project brief?
Project brief is basically what you want the facility to provide. So it could be as simple as, please provide 4 operating theatres and associated accommodation, or it could be, please provide a new district general hospital with the following clinical disciplines. As it develops, that will come into more detailed space in terms of numbers of bed spaces, numbers of facilities, range of facilities, and forms the basis of what would commonly be called an output specification, i.e. what we want to get at the end of the project.
And then do we see at paragraph 4.4 onwards, there's a detailed analysis of the ventilation safety group?
Yeah.
And does that really just set out, in perhaps in slightly more detail, the summary you've provided of what the ventilation safety group is and what its purpose is?
It does.
And if we then look on to page 349, do we see now a specific section entitled Derogations and Alternative Design Strategies? So page 349, paragraph 4.10. Any derogations or alternative design strategies from this guidance should be subject to the scrutiny and agreement in writing by the VSG. The reason for the derogation or alternative design strategy and limits to its application should be recorded. Designers proposing a derogation or alternative strategy should be able to supply a body of evidence that their proposal will provide a degree of safety no less than if the guidance in this document had been followed. Do you see that?
Yep.
So not simply stating we're going to do something different, there has to be a body of evidence to support that. Then we see in the note, perhaps reading the final sentence, there should be evidence that what is being proposed has been successful elsewhere. Do you see that? Then if we look over the page onto page 350, top right hand corner, paragraph 4.17, new build healthcare facilities must be fully compliant with the requirements of all legislation in force at the date agreed when signing the contract. They should comply with the guidance contained in the current HTM unless a derogation has been agreed with the VSG. And then we see the reference back to the procedures for agreeing that derogation. Within this document, there's obviously reference to commissioning and validation. Had anything in substance changed in relation to commissioning and validation since the 2007 HTM?
Yes.
What had changed?
The level of detail contained in Chapter 12 for the validation process has been articulated far more clearly, and there is specific reference to the different stages when witnessing or validation of the installation should take place. It's also expanded the level of commissioning and validation testing that is required for ventilation systems, such as leakage testing of ductwork.
So same procedure, but a beefed up specification
Same basic
of what has to
principle,
be
but
done.
far more detail and far more prescriptive.
If we could then look on, please, to Appendix 2 on page 482. Again, I think you'd mentioned previously in your evidence that there had been a slight change to this table from the 2007 version, but we still see, for example, a general ward's got 6 air changes per hour, critical care areas still have 10 air changes per hour. So were there significant changes from 2007 to 2021?
It depends on your definition of significant. As an example, operating theatres dropped from 25 down to 22 air changes per hour, but with the adjustment in the in-use tolerance, as I've previously outlined. Endoscope treatment procedure rooms were changed from positive pressure to negative pressure. Cascades, due to a reassessment of the risks associated with multi-drug resistant TB, versus a interventional clinical procedure. However, we also recognised the fact that within endoscopy procedures, it is sedation that is used and not full anaesthesiology. Therefore, the air change rates were dropped from 15 to 10, where sedation anaesthesiology was only used and not full anaesthesiology. If full anaesthesiology is used, 15 remains the correct levels.
And in terms of the specific values, in terms of air changes per hour and other values that we see in there, is your explanation as to why we find those various figures, is that the same as for HTM 0301 2007, that it's a consensus view based on, as you understand it, a certain body of evidence?
Yes.
And again, could you just explain exactly how this process came about in terms of the discussions amongst the multidisciplinary parties involved?
Discussions took place. There were varying drivers and influencing factors, not least of which the need to, as far as practically and safely achievable, move towards net carbon zero. And you will see many of the changes between the 2001 and the 07 standards based around energy and plant efficiency. So we still want the right amount of air, but we don't want as much safety margin or to over-engineer solutions which are extremely energy hungry. Ventilation is a huge user of energy, and as such is a major contributor to the carbon footprint of the NHS. So as far as reasonably practicable, where it did not impact patient safety, those levels were reduced to a safe standard, but not an excessive standard.
Thank you. If I could ask you, please, to have your statement in front of you and to look to paragraph 56 on page 121, please. And I want to ask you some questions about the development of a ventilation system. So page 121, paragraph 56. You say, I've been asked if I've knowledge or experience in the key stages in development of a hospital ventilation system. This is something I've been involved in throughout my career in different roles and stages. You see that? So we've seen reference within the HTMs to a project brief. How does a project start in terms of the ventilation system?
Once a clinical output spec has been established, so we know what the facility is intended to do, a layout of rooms will normally be drawn up in a stage 1 feasibility design. From that point, an output specification for ventilation would be produced, which would specify air change rate, pressure cascades that we would expect in various classifications of the rooms identified being present within the design. That would be used as the basis of the design and plant layout, and would be referred back to ensure at completion of design stage the ventilation performance was as per the output, provided that the clinical functions hadn't changed during that process.
So if we take each of those stages, you said the first stage is a clinical output specification.
Yes.
What would we see in a document called a clinical output specification?
It very much depends upon the nature of the project. In its crudest forms, it could be provide a 30-bed respiratory ward facility or an expanded ICU facility. It needs to be what you actually clinically want to do in that space. It could be multi-clinical function. So if it's a hospital, it will define each department that is going to be present within that space. From that, we can produce an output ventilation strategy or a performance specification, which specifies all these areas, these are the air change rates that we would expect to see, these are the pressure cascades, etc., etc. From that, the designer has the basis to move forward and undertake the design.
So the clinical output specification, is that produced by the trust or is it produced by an external body?
It's produced by the trust.
Okay. And then you mentioned the next stage being the layout of rooms. Again, would that be produced by the trust or by a body external to the trust?
It's normally a combination of both. It's where the profession of healthcare planning comes in, and you need the clinicians know the patient flow and the patient pathway. You need to lay out the accommodation in such a way that it makes logical sense for the patient pathway through the service.
And then I've got you noted as saying that there was then a further output specification after that. Is that correct?
There is then the technical output specification for the ventilation, which is produced based on, if we're having this accommodation in this area, this is the ventilation that is required within those clinical spaces.
And would that be produced by the trust, or would it be produced by a body outside the trust?
It would normally be produced by the trust with support from the AE or AP.
From the authorising engineer or the authorised person, but not necessarily with external input, or would external input be required?
Well, the AE is technically an external input, so it can involve M&E designers. It very much depends upon the design approach that's being adopted and whether the feasibility stage is covered by professional support, i.e. an M&E contractor or M&E design consultant and architect, which is often the case.
And then after that, you said there'd be a more detailed design that would be built out from there.
As the project progresses, you then get the more detailed design developed.
In terms of the discussion that we had earlier today, in terms of room data sheets, when would they be produced?
The reality is that the room data sheets will be derived from the activity database at an early stage, but not refined or fully developed until detailed design has been normally completed.
And who would develop the room data sheets from the activity database? Would that be done by the trust, or would it be done by an external contractor?
It would normally be done by an external consultant, but with close working and liaison with the trust.
If I could ask you to look within your statement, please, to paragraph 57. So approximately just over halfway down, you use the term ventilation strategy. Do you see that? So you say, yep, this will assist in creating the ventilation strategy which should be provided to the design team. Can you just explain, what do you mean by the ventilation strategy?
It is the output performance specification for the ventilation system. It's identifying which areas we want ventilated to what level.
So again, just so I'm understanding, the clinical output specification, and then moving on to the technical output specification, just remind me, when do the room data sheets come in?
The room data sheets come in once you've got a finalised layout of rooms. You then start populating individual room data sheets. The information to populate those room data sheets, framework comes from the activity database, which is then refined subject to what you've put into the ventilation strategy or ventilation output spec to refine the ventilation rates required room by room.
And if there was going to be a derogation from the standards in the health technical memorandum, at what stage in the development of the specification would you expect that to be identified?
Derogations are typically identified at detailed design stage.
And before 2021, would the authorising engineer have had a role in that derogation process?
Technically, yes, they should have. Yes, they should.
You say they should. Would that always have happened in practice?
Well, the difficulty is that HCM 0301 2007 was written before the role of AE was written. So it wasn't until 2014 that the 00 standard first identified the formal role of AE. So between 2007 and 2014, technically there was no role of AE. So it would be difficult to say that they would always be involved. However, it should be that decisions of that nature affecting ventilation should have sought the advice and approval of those individuals now known as authorising engineers, but also directors of infection prevention control and clinicians, so they could assess the potential impact of any of those derogations. If it was a non-performance related derogation, such as the energy efficiency or air leakage rates, then that is more of a technical determination, but it should still be discussed and agreed within the technical elements of what are now called the VSG.
Do you have experience in relation to reference designs?
Some.
Can you just explain what experience do you have of reference?
Reference designs are generally a sharing of, we've done this at this hospital and it worked well. This is the standard by which you can operate this type of facility. They generally are obviously specific to the individual design that they relate to, and normally need some adaptation to fit the geographic location or service requirements of a particular hospital that is being designed.
Are you familiar with the differences between a reference design and an exemplar design?
In broad terms, yes.
Is there a normal extent of detail that you'd expect to see within a reference design?
There are levels of detail which I would expect to see at the various stages of design, but those stages can, depending upon how detailed they get, determine the level of detail that you get on ventilation layouts.
And I appreciate it's difficult to be specific, but in terms of the volume of detail on a sliding scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not very detailed, 10 being extremely detailed, where would you expect that to land for a reference?
I would normally expect within a reference design to at least have the room performance parameters detailed. I would not expect to see the level of detail of service sizing, service runs, but general where things are going to be located, primary plant areas, general room performances, I would expect to see.
And in the period from when HTM 00 brought in the concept of an authorising engineer, would the authorising engineer have had a role at the time of the development of a reference?
Again, ideally, I would expect so, yes.
Okay. And what would you expect that role to be?
Similar to the production of a ventilation strategy or output performance specification.
During the course of the development of a reference design, which did contain detail of relative pressurisation of individual rooms or wards, would you expect a health board or its design advisors to identify and seek a derogation in respect of any departure from relevant ventilation standards in HTM 0301?
It would very much determine on what the derogation, extent of derogation was and the impact of it. If it was a infectious disease unit, most definitely yes. If it was a general ward area, possibly not.
And in your opinion?
Sorry, Mr. McGregor, could I just have the proposition, and I'm sure it's entirely my fault. We're talking about a hypothetical reference design.
Indeed.
And that hypothetical reference design includes how much, are you supposing it includes information about air changes and pressure, or not necessarily?
Which did contain detail of relative pressurisation of individual rooms or wards.
Right. Okay, could I ask it right with, now that I've got the proposition more firmly in my head, could I
Certainly,
ask you to put it to the witness?
Ask the question again. So during the course of the development of a reference design, which did contain detail of relative pressurisation of individual rooms or wards, would you expect the Health Board or its design advisors to identify and seek a derogation in respect of any departure from relevant ventilation standards, such as in HTM 0301?
I would expect it to be highlighted that it was a deemed variation to that standard, and if it was of sufficient impact to warrant a derogation, then yes, it should be formally sought and recorded.
And should a reference design dealing with the ventilation requirements of clinical rooms or wards be approved by clinicians or infection control specialists before it's issued for tender, in your view?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Poplett. That concludes all the questions I have for you at the moment. Lord Brody, that concludes all the questions I would wish. There have been discussions between myself and core participants council to try to avoid any formal Rule 9 applications. So your Lordship may wish to check whether there's any additional issues that council for core participants would wish to raise.
Before I do that, Mr. Poplett, are you the person, or are you a person, ask about how activity databases are used in practice? We've touched on them, and I've got a sort of high-level understanding of how the activity database is a source of information from which I assume architects, but maybe others as well, can derive information which can then be expressed in room data sheets. But I have to say, I don't quite understand how that process is carried out in practice. But this may not be your particular sphere of expertise.
It isn't, but my understanding of the process, having been through it on a fair few occasions, is that the clinical output spec will identify, and I will use a single example of a treatment room. From the activity database, there is a, if you like, library of these are the typical performance parameters, engineering services, space requirements, fixtures and fittings that we would expect to find in a treatment room. That would be transferred from the ADB into a room data sheet for the treatment room under development. It would then be adjusted or tweaked to suit the specific requirements of the clinical treatment that is planned for that space. So if it was that they were going to be doing endoscopy or fluoroscopy examinations within it, it moves from a treatment space specifically to a specific endoscopy treatment room space. And that is within the RDS, where it is, if you like, tweaked and personalised to the specific requirements for that room in that project.
And is the RDS expressed as a series of outputs, or is it expressed as a architect's drawing?
In practice, it is both. There is normally an architect's drawing, and at that stage it is typically at a 1 to 50 scale, so it's quite detailed in terms of the contents. The RDS will also include the environmental conditions, lighting levels, ventilation levels, water provision, but it will also typically include details of furniture, fixings and equipment that would be provided as part of the scheme. So soap dispensers, mirrors, etc. can be detailed to that level of detail within an RDS. What they tend not to show, although they can, and it's particularly prevalent within PFI schemes, is loose equipment. So equipment is categorised as either Group 1, 2, 3 or 4. Group 1 equipment is fixed within the structure and is always listed within the RDSs. Group 2 is fixed but loose equipment, so a washing machine. If you pick the room up and shook it, it wouldn't fall out because it's plumbed in. Group 3, which is loose equipment, waste paper baskets, desks, chairs. And Group 4, which is technical IT equipment. So basically, an RDS can be as detailed as you want it to be, but you use the activity database as the framework, adjust it to suit the particular requirements of your design or clinical requirement, and you add the necessary detail in terms of services, performance, and if you go to that level of detail, fixtures and fittings that the room would be expected to have.
And if I followed that, that supposes that there are a number of generally agreed descriptors for rooms. You used the example of a treatment room. So the activity database is accessed through a given number of generally agreed descriptors of particular rooms that you would expect, or particular spaces you'd expect to find within a healthcare facility.
That is my understanding.
Right. Thank you. That takes me a bit along the road. Now, Mr. McGregor anticipated that there would be nothing arising out of his questioning. Was he right about that? Well, I'll take that as an affirmation. Thank you very much, Mr. Poplett, for your evidence. And we'll now be rising, so we'll all rise together. We're not sitting tomorrow, as I understand it, but on Thursday we will sit again at 10 o'clock. I think maybe on Friday we may be sitting a little earlier. But as far as Thursday is concerned, I look forward to see the legal representatives at 10 o'clock on Thursday. And thank you again, Mr. Paul.